Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. My name is Dr. Elias Ward, and what I'm about to tell you happened 6 months ago in the depths of space, 4.2 billion miles from the Sun. I'm an astrophysicist specializing in deep space anomalies, and I work for Nexus Dynamics, a private research contractor that tracks unregistered signals in the outer solar system. For the past 12 years, I've spent my life cataloguing the vast emptiness between worlds, monitoring communications traffic, and documenting the slow dance of ice and rock that surrounds our solar system like a protective shell. Most of our work is routine. We track debris from failed missions, monitor the fading signals of ancient probes, and occasionally investigate reports of unusual activity in the outer reaches. It's solitary work, the kind that appeals to people who prefer the company of stars to the complications of human society. I thought I understood the universe and my place in it. I was wrong about everything. It was a cold Friday morning in March when my world shattered. I was aboard our research vessel Meridian, a converted mining ship that Nexus had retrofitted with the most advanced deep space monitoring equipment available. The ship housed a crew of 6, though we rarely worked closely together. Space has a way of making you appreciate solitude, and we'd all learned to give each other room to breathe in the confines of our metal tomb. I was in the communications bay, running my usual sweep of background radiation and signal traffic when my equipment detected something that violated every law of probability I knew. A faint distress beacon, barely strong enough to register above cosmic background noise, broadcasting on frequencies that haven't been used since the 1980s. The signal was coming from coordinates where absolutely nothing should exist, a region of space so empty that finding a grain of sand would be considered miraculous. The beacon transmitted in standard emergency code, repeating the same message every 37 seconds with mechanical precision. SOS, location, request immediate assistance. But the location was impossible. 4.2 billion miles from the Sun, deep in the Oort Cloud where temperatures hover just above absolute zero, and the nearest object might be 1 million miles away. My hands trembled as I ran the signal through every filter and analysis program we had, desperately hoping for equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference. Each test confirmed the same impossible result. The signal was real, it was human-made, and it was coming from somewhere no human vessel had ever travelled. I called Captain Silas Corrin to the communications bay. Silas is ex-military, a man who spent 15 years in deep space patrol before taking this job. He has the kind of weathered face that's seen combat in the asteroid belt campaigns, with scars along his jaw from a hull breach that nearly killed him during the Titan incident. When Silas looks at something, he sees it clearly, without illusion or wishful thinking. His presence had always been reassuring, but today, even his steady confidence couldn't calm my racing pulse. He studied the readout for several minutes, his expression growing more troubled with each passing second. Could be debris from an old satellite, he said, but I could hear the doubt creeping into his voice like poison. Maybe something launched in the early days that we lost track of. At 4 billion miles out? I shook my head, feeling reality shift beneath my feet. Captain, nothing we've ever launched has gone that far and survived. The Voyager probes are barely past the heliopause, and they've been travelling for over 40 years. Jareth Locke, our systems engineer, joined us at the console with the predatory alertness of a man who'd spent too many years uncovering corporate lies. Jareth is the kind of cynical genius who questions everything, a former corporate troubleshooter who'd seen too many cover-ups to trust anything at face value. His expertise in system analysis and data recovery had made him invaluable on missions like this, but his perpetual suspicion of authority made him difficult to work with. He ran the signal through our most sophisticated analysis software and looked up at us with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something between excitement and pure terror. "It's definitely human-made," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "The encoding, the frequency modulation, even the power signature. This is a standard emergency beacon, probably manufactured sometime in the late 70s or early 80s. But here's what doesn't make sense. The signal strength suggests the transmitter is massive, much larger than anything that should be out there." The excitement I felt at that moment was unlike anything in my career. A rush of discovery that made my vision blur and my heart race like I'd been injected with pure adrenaline. I'd spent 12 years documenting the empty spaces between worlds, cataloguing ice and rock and the occasional piece of space junk. The possibility of finding a human vessel in the Oort Cloud was beyond extraordinary. It was revolutionary. It would rewrite our understanding of early space exploration and raise questions about missions that might have been classified or forgotten by history. Captain Corin ordered an immediate course change, his voice cutting through the ship's intercom with military precision. "All hands, prepare for deep space approach. We're investigating a possible derelict vessel. Standard salvage protocols are now in effect, but I want everyone to stay sharp. This situation is unprecedented, and I don't want any surprises." Milo Drager, our ship's medic, joined us on the bridge as we began our approach. Milo was the youngest member of our crew at 28, with the kind of nervous energy that usually served him well in emergency situations. He trained as a trauma surgeon before joining deep space operations, drawn by the adventure and the substantial pay increases that came with working in the outer system. But today, his usual enthusiasm was replaced by a tension I'd never seen before, as if some primal instinct was warning him about what we might find. "How long to intercept?" Milo asked, checking his medical kit with the automatic precision of someone who'd handled too many emergencies where seconds meant the difference between life and death. 18 hours at current acceleration, Corin replied, his fingers dancing across the navigation controls, assuming we don't run into any surprises. Elena Vasquez, our navigation specialist, was already plotting approach vectors and calculating fuel requirements with the methodical precision that had kept us alive through dozens of dangerous missions. Elena had worked civilian freight routes for 10 years before joining our crew, and her knowledge of deep space navigation was encyclopedic. She rarely spoke unless she had something important to say, but when she did, we all listened with the respect due to someone who'd never been wrong about the dangers of space travel. "Captain," Elena said, her voice carefully controlled, in the way that meant she was about to deliver bad news. "I've been running probability calculations on finding a human vessel at these coordinates. The statistical likelihood approaches 0. Either we're dealing with something completely unprecedented, or we're being led into a trap by someone who understands our psychology well enough to bait us with an irresistible mystery." The 6th member of our crew, Tommy Chen, was monitoring our ship's systems from the engineering deck with the paranoid attention to detail that had saved our lives more than once. Tommy was a mechanical genius with an intuitive understanding of how machines worked, but he had a tendency to see conspiracy in every equipment malfunction. His paranoia had prevented catastrophic failures on multiple occasions, but it also made him exhausting to be around during long missions. "All systems nominal," Tommy's voice crackled through the intercom, carrying an undertone of unease that made my skin crawl. "But I'm reading some unusual electromagnetic interference. Could be natural phenomena, but it's unlike anything in our databases. The patterns are too regular, too organized. It's almost like something is deliberately generating interference to mask its presence." The journey to the signal's coordinates gave us 18 hours to research and speculate, 18 hours that felt like an eternity as we hurtled through the void toward an impossible discovery. I spent most of that time reviewing historical records of space missions, looking for any reference to deep space expeditions that might have reached the Oort Cloud. The official records showed nothing beyond automated probes, but there were gaps in the data, missions that had been classified or lost to bureaucratic incompetence. Jareth discovered references to several private aerospace companies that had attempted ambitious deep space missions in the late 70s and 80s. Most had ended in bankruptcy or scandal, but a few had simply vanished from public records entirely. Corporate espionage and government black projects had been common during that era, and it was possible that someone had launched a secret mission that exceeded all public achievements. "Look at this," Jareth said, pulling up a declassified document on his terminal. "Project Deep Reach, a joint venture between 3 corporations and an unnamed government agency. The mission parameters are heavily redacted, but it mentions extended duration exploration of outer system anomalies and evaluation of resources beyond conventional orbital mechanics. The project was terminated suddenly in 1982, and all records were sealed." The implications sent ice through my veins. If there had been secret missions to the outer system, missions so classified that their very existence had been erased from history, then we might be approaching something far more significant than a simple derelict vessel. When we finally got visual contact through our ship's telescope, what we saw defied every expectation and shattered our understanding of what was possible. A massive derelict vessel, roughly 800 feet long and 200 feet wide, drifted silently through the void like a metal tomb carved from nightmares. Ancient ice had formed around parts of its hull, creating a crystalline shell that reflected our searchlights in fractured rainbows that hurt to observe directly. But it was the surface damage that truly caught our attention and made my blood turn to liquid nitrogen in my veins. The entire hull was riddled with thousands of small punctures, each roughly 6 inches in diameter and perfectly circular. They covered the ship from bow to stern, in patterns that seemed random at first glance, but the longer I studied them, the more I realized they formed deliberate, geometric arrangements, as if something had been systematically mapping the vessel's internal structure from the outside. Near the stern, several larger breaches had been torn in the metal, their edges twisted outward in ways that suggested tremendous force applied with surgical precision. "No power signatures," Milo reported, studying the sensor readings with growing unease. "No heat emissions, no life signs, no electromagnetic activity. Whatever happened here, it happened a long time ago, but the hull temperature is wrong, Captain. It's warmer than it should be after years in the void, as if something inside is generating heat." But there were details that didn't fit the picture of a simple derelict. Details that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up and whisper warnings, in a language older than civilization. The ship's configuration suggested it was designed for long-term space travel, with massive fuel tanks, expanded life support systems, and what appeared to be a sophisticated communications array. This wasn't a routine mission that had simply gone wrong. It was something far more ambitious and mysterious. Most disturbing of all, the nameplate on the ship's hull had been deliberately destroyed, with methodical thoroughness that spoke of intelligence and planning. Someone had used high-energy plasma cutters to obliterate any identifying marks, scraping away serial numbers and removing manufacturer's marks with surgical precision. Whoever had done this hadn't wanted the vessel identified, and they'd had the time and equipment to do the job thoroughly. Captain Corrin was already calculating salvage values, unable to hide the excitement in his voice as he contemplated the fortune floating before us. "Gentlemen, that's retirement money drifting out there," he said, his eyes reflecting the same crystalline light that surrounded the derelict. "Whatever happened to her crew, that ship belongs to whoever finds her now. The technology alone would be worth millions, and if there's any cargo or research data aboard, we're looking at enough money to buy our own fleet. Jareth wasn't so optimistic, his paranoid instincts screaming warnings that the rest of us were too excited to hear. "Look at those hull punctures," he said, enhancing the image on our main screen until the damage was visible, in terrifying detail. They were made from the outside and they're too regular to be random impacts. Something with intelligence created those entry points, something that understood the ship's construction well enough to target structural weak points with mathematical precision. Elena was running calculations on her navigation computer, her face growing paler with each result. The ship's trajectory suggests it's been drifting for at least 15 years, maybe longer. But here's what's strange. Its path doesn't match any known launch window or destination. It's moving in a direction that would have required a massive course correction somewhere in the outer system, and the fuel requirements for such a maneuver would have been enormous. The implications of her analysis were troubling enough to make my stomach clench with dread. If the ship had changed course after leaving Earth, it meant the crew had been alive and in control long enough to make navigational decisions. But if that was true, why hadn't they sent any distress signals before now? Why had they allowed their ship to drift into the empty void between stars, broadcasting their location only when it was far too late for rescue? We spent 6 hours in careful approach, using our thrusters to match velocity and trajectory with the derelict, in a dance of orbital mechanics that brought us steadily closer to answers we weren't prepared to receive. This close, the damage was even more extensive than we'd realized, and I found myself studying the puncture marks with growing horror as their true purpose became clear. The holes weren't random attempts at entry. They formed deliberate patterns that suggested systematic exploration by whatever had created them. Near each breach, the metal showed signs of unusual corrosion, as if it had been exposed to some kind of chemical agent that dissolved molecular bonds with terrifying efficiency. Most disturbing of all, some of the punctures showed signs of being enlarged from the inside, as if something had entered the ship and then modified the openings to allow easier passage. Tommy's voice came through the intercom with barely controlled anxiety that made everyone on the bridge tense with shared fear. "Captain, I'm reading massive structural stress throughout the vessel. Those holes go deep, probably all the way through to the interior compartments. Whatever made them wasn't just trying to get in, it was trying to get at something specific inside. The distribution pattern suggests they were searching for crew quarters and life support systems." We prepared a boarding party consisting of myself, Captain Corrin, and Jareth, leaving Elena to maintain our position relative to the derelict, while Milo stood by for medical emergencies and Tommy monitored all systems for signs of trouble. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Get aboard, conduct a preliminary survey, and determine whether the vessel was worth salvaging or too dangerous to approach. The docking procedure took nearly 3 hours as we carefully maneuvered alongside the derelict, every movement bringing us closer to answers that might destroy our sanity. The ship's airlock still functioned on emergency power, which was both encouraging and deeply disturbing. Emergency power meant the vessel hadn't been completely dead for long, but it also meant someone or something might have maintained the basic systems long after the crew was gone. As we suited up for boarding, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease that felt like ice water flowing through my veins. The derelict hung in space like a predator waiting to strike, its damaged hull creating shadows that seemed to move independently of our lights and respond to our presence with malevolent intelligence. The silence of vacuum was absolute, but somehow the ship felt anything but quiet. The interior was pitch black, filled with floating debris and frozen moisture that sparkled in our helmet lights like malevolent stars, celebrating our arrival. Emergency lighting flickered to life as we moved through the main corridor, triggered by motion sensors that had somehow survived whatever catastrophe had befallen the crew. The air that greeted us when we tested the atmosphere was technically breathable, but carried an undertone of decay that made my stomach revolt. "No bodies," Captain Corrian observed as we made our way deeper into the ship, his voice echoing strangely in the recycled atmosphere. "That's unusual for a disaster scenario. Usually you find remains, even if they're just bones or frozen tissue. But the absence of bodies was only one piece of a larger puzzle that grew more disturbing with each step we took. Personal belongings were scattered everywhere, floating in zero gravity, as if people had simply vanished mid-activity. In the galley, we found meals half-eaten, the food frozen solid but still recognizable. Coffee cups drifted near workstations where their owners had been interrupted. Family photos hung loose from their moorings, showing smiling faces we would never be able to identify. The ship's layout suggested a crew of at least 15 people, possibly more, based on the number of personal quarters and workstations we discovered. We found recreational areas, specialized laboratories, and research equipment that indicated serious scientific investigation rather than simple transport or mining operations. This hadn't been a routine mission. It had been an expedition with multiple objectives and substantial financial backing. Jareth managed to access the ship's emergency power systems and restore minimal lighting to the main sections, bringing the vessel back to a semblance of life that felt more like resurrection than revival. Computer terminals flickered to life throughout the ship, their displays showing system failures and error messages dating back years. But the central computer core was still functional, protected by redundant power systems and radiation shielding that had kept it operational through whatever disaster had claimed the crew. That's when we discovered the ship's identity, and everything we thought we knew about the situation changed forever. Internal displays showed her name, the Astrolabe, and her registry indicated she was a privately owned deep space research vessel that had been reported missing 3 years ago. I remembered the story now. It had been significant news in the aerospace community for several weeks. 15 crew members, including some of the most respected scientists in deep space research, had simply vanished during what was supposed to be a routine survey mission. The official investigation had concluded that the ship suffered a catastrophic system failure somewhere beyond Neptune's orbit. Search and rescue operations had been mounted, but the vastness of space and the ship's unknown trajectory had made recovery impossible. After 6 months, the crew had been declared dead and the incident closed with the bureaucratic finality that marked the end of hope. But here was the Astrolabe, 4 billion miles from where it should have been, clearly the victim of something far more sinister than equipment failure. The real breakthrough came when Jareth accessed the ship's internal security system, unlocking a treasure trove of information that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. The Astrolabe had been equipped with a comprehensive network of cameras and sensors designed to monitor both crew safety and research activities. Dozens of hours of footage had been preserved in the emergency storage banks, protected by the same systems that had kept the ship's basic functions operational. We found a secure compartment in the ship's data center and began reviewing the recordings on our portable equipment. The early footage showed normal crew operations, and I found myself studying the faces of people who had been dead for years, watching them go about their daily routines with no knowledge of the horror that awaited them in the darkness between stars. Captain Haldron commanded the Astrolabe with quiet authority that reminded me uncomfortably of Corrin himself. He was a distinguished man in his 50s with greying hair, and the kind of confident bearing that came from decades of successful deep space operations. I'd heard of him by reputation, a veteran explorer who'd led some of the most ambitious private expeditions in recent history. Watching him move through his ship with casual competence, I felt a chill of recognition that this could be any of us in a few years. His chief engineer was Kellen, a young man in his early 30s with an infectious enthusiasm for his work that reminded me painfully of Milo's usual demeanor. The footage showed him constantly moving throughout the ship, checking systems, making repairs, and generally keeping things running smoothly, with the kind of passionate dedication that made everyone around him feel more optimistic. He had the kind of personality that could maintain morale during the long isolation of deep space travel, the sort of person whose loss would be devastating to crew cohesion. Dr. Nina Cross served as the mission's chief scientist, and her credentials were impressive enough to make me feel inadequate by comparison. She'd published groundbreaking research on the composition of Oort Cloud objects and had been instrumental in developing new techniques for deep space mineral analysis. The footage showed her as methodical and precise, someone who approached every problem with scientific rigor and careful documentation. She was exactly the kind of person who should have been able to solve whatever crisis they encountered. The remaining crew included specialists in navigation, communications, life support, and various scientific disciplines. They worked together with the casual efficiency of professionals who trained extensively and trusted each other completely. During the first several weeks of their mission, everything proceeded exactly as planned, creating a false sense of security that made what followed even more horrifying. Their objective had been ambitious but straightforward, and watching them pursue it filled me with dread about our own future missions. Spend 6 months in the Oort Cloud identifying and cataloguing objects that might be suitable for future mining operations. Private companies were investing heavily in asteroid mining technology, and surveys like this were essential for identifying the most profitable targets. The Astrolabe was equipped with advanced sensors and analysis equipment that allowed them to evaluate potential mining sites from a distance. The first signs of trouble appeared in the 3rd week of their mission, and the subtlety of the initial warning signs made them all the more terrifying. Hull impact sensors began registering collisions with micro-objects, dozens of tiny impacts that should have been statistically impossible in the nearly empty space of the Oort Cloud. The crew initially dismissed these as sensor malfunctions or impacts too small to cause concern, but the frequency and regularity of the impacts suggested something more systematic. Dr. Cross conducted a thorough analysis of the impact data and found disturbing patterns that should have served as a warning of what was coming. The collisions weren't random, they were concentrated in specific areas of the hull, and they seemed to be occurring in response to the ship's activities. When the crew conducted external sensor sweeps, the impacts increased. When they transmitted data back to Earth, the frequency doubled. "It's as if something is responding to our presence," Dr. Cross noted in her research log, her voice carrying the first hints of the fear that would eventually consume them all. "The impacts correlate with our electronic emissions and movement patterns. I'm beginning to suspect we're not alone out here, and whatever's with us is learning our routines." By the 5th week, the situation had escalated beyond simple equipment anomalies into something that defied rational explanation. Tools that had been securely stored were found floating in different compartments, arranged in ways that defied the ship's gravitational systems. Food supplies were discovered, moved and rearranged in storage bays, with items missing or relocated according to no discernible pattern, except perhaps that systematic study of human behavior. Most disturbing of all, the crew began hearing sounds inside the ship that had no mechanical explanation. Scratching noises in the ventilation shafts, initially attributed to thermal expansion as the vessel moved between areas of varying temperature. Soft impacts against interior bulkheads that couldn't be explained by normal ship operations. Whispers and movements in sections of the ship that were supposed to be empty. Sounds that were always just at the edge of perception and never quite clear enough to analyze. "The psychological stress is becoming significant," Captain Haldron noted in his personal log, his voice carrying the strain of command in an impossible situation. 3 crew members have reported nightmares about being watched through the observation windows. Davidson claims he saw something moving outside during his watch, but external cameras showed nothing. I'm beginning to wonder if isolation is affecting our judgment, but the equipment readings suggest otherwise. The footage from week 7 showed a crew on edge, their casual professionalism replaced by nervous vigilance and growing paranoia. They were sleeping less, jumping at unexpected sounds, looking over their shoulders constantly. Several had taken to working in pairs, unwilling to be alone in remote sections of the ship. The casual efficiency of their early mission had been replaced by the kind of hypervigilance that marked people who knew they were being hunted. Then Kellen Stroud vanished, and everything changed forever. The security footage from the hydroponics bay showed him performing routine maintenance on the plant growth systems that provided fresh air and supplemental food for the crew. He was alone, working efficiently on a malfunctioning water pump, occasionally humming to himself in the way people do when they think no one is listening. The timestamp showed it was just after midnight during the ship's artificial night cycle, when most of the crew was sleeping. Stroud was bent over the pump assembly, tools spread around him in the organized chaos of a skilled technician, when something dropped from the ceiling directly above the camera's field of view. The movement was a blur of pale flesh and jointed limbs, descending with terrifying speed and precision that spoke of intelligence and planning. Stroud barely had time to look up, his face registering surprise rather than fear, before he was seized by multiple appendages and dragged upward into the ventilation system above. His screams echoed through the ship for nearly 10 minutes, growing fainter as he was pulled deeper into the network of ducts and passages that ran throughout the vessel like arteries in a living body. Emergency alarms triggered automatically, waking the entire crew and sending them scrambling for emergency stations. But by the time they organized the search party, the sounds had stopped completely, leaving only silence and the terrifying knowledge that something was hunting them. "Jesus," Captain Corrin whispered, as we watched the footage, his voice carrying the same horror I felt clawing at my sanity. "What the hell was that thing?" I rewound and played the sequence again, trying to get a better view of whatever had taken Stroud with such casual efficiency. The attack happened so quickly that individual frames were blurred, but certain details were clearly visible and burned themselves into my memory with the persistence of traumatic experience. Multiple limbs, each ending in what appeared to be razor-sharp appendages. Pale, almost luminescent flesh stretched over an elongated frame. And most disturbing of all, a sense of intelligence and purpose in its movements that suggested careful planning rather than animal instinct. The remaining crew armed themselves with plasma cutters, welding torches and anything else that might serve as a weapon against an enemy they couldn't understand. Captain Haldron organized systematic searches of the ship, but the ventilation system was too complex and extensive to thoroughly explore. The ducts were barely wide enough for human passage, yet something had clearly moved through them with ease, navigating the maze of passages as if it had studied the ship's blueprints for years. Dr. Cross took charge of the scientific investigation, being the most analytically minded of the survivors and the one most likely to find rational explanations for impossible events. She reviewed the security footage dozens of times, measuring and analysing every detail she could extract from the blurred images. Her conclusions were methodical, scientific, and absolutely terrifying in their implications. The entity exhibits characteristics of both predator and parasite, she recorded in her research log, her voice steady, despite the circumstances that would have broken lesser minds. Its movements suggest detailed knowledge of our ship's layout and systems. The timing of its attack indicates it has been observing us for weeks, learning our routines and identifying optimal opportunities. This was not a random encounter. It was a carefully planned ambush by something that understands human psychology well enough to maximize our fear and confusion. The crew installed additional cameras and motion sensors throughout the ship, hoping to detect any further intrusions before they could claim more victims. They established a buddy system requiring that no one work alone in remote areas. Sleep schedules were reorganized so that someone was always awake and monitoring the security feeds. Despite these precautions, they all knew they were fighting an enemy that understood their vessel better than they did. 3 days after Stroud's disappearance, they got their first clear view of the intruders, and the footage that captured these creatures changed my understanding of what was possible in our universe. Multiple entities had somehow entered the ship, moving through sections where no human could fit and appearing in areas that should have been completely secure. The security cameras captured them in fragments, brief glimpses of pale flesh and jointed limbs moving with predatory grace through corridors and maintenance areas. But when the cameras managed to capture them fully, the result was a nightmare that defied biological classification. They were tall and emaciated, standing nearly 7 feet in height but weighing perhaps half what a human of similar size would weigh. Their torsos were elongated and flexible, allowing them to contort through spaces that seemed impossibly narrow. 6 spindly limbs extended from their central body, each ending in appendages that could serve as both hands and weapons with equal efficiency. Their heads were small and angular, dominated by large black eyes that reflected light like those of deep sea creatures adapted to eternal darkness. Most unnervingly, they moved in complete silence despite their size and the metal construction of the ship. Whether walking, climbing, or hanging from overhead structures, they produced no sound whatsoever. This stealth ability allowed them to position themselves for attacks without triggering any of the crew's motion sensors or audio monitors, making them nearly invisible until they chose to strike. The footage showed these beings stalking individual crew members with patience and intelligence that was genuinely frightening to observe. They never attacked in groups, instead coordinating their movements to isolate targets through carefully planned ambushes. They seemed to understand human psychology well enough to maximize fear and confusion, striking when their victims were alone and vulnerable, always ensuring that the survivors would find evidence of the attack. Dr. Cross was taken in the medical bay while conducting research on biological samples from the outer system, working late into the night surrounded by specimen containers and analysis equipment. The recording showed her absorbed in her work, occasionally making notes or adjusting her microscope, when 3 of the creatures emerged from ventilation grates simultaneously. The attack was coordinated with military precision, cutting off all escape routes and overwhelming her defenses before she could call for help. She fought back with a plasma cutter, managing to sever one creature's limb in a burst of superheated gas and sparks that illuminated the medical bay in hellish light. The severed appendage writhed independently for several seconds before going still, leaking a dark fluid that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, but her resistance was brief and ultimately futile against opponents who had planned this attack with scientific precision. The beings beat her against the bulkheads with calculated brutality, striking with enough force to break bones, but not enough to kill immediately. Her screams filled the medical bay as they systematically disabled her arms and legs, ensuring she couldn't fight back or escape. When she finally lost consciousness and stopped struggling, they carried her limp form through a maintenance hatch that led to the ship's central core. The remaining crew watched the footage in horrified silence, realizing that their shipmate had been taken alive for some purpose they couldn't comprehend and probably didn't want to understand. Captain Haldron organized immediate search parties, but the creatures had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The maintenance hatch Dr. Cross had been dragged through led to a network of passages too narrow for human exploration, and no amount of sensor scanning could locate where she had been taken. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come, something that transformed the situation from simple predation into something far more sinister. 4 days after her capture, Dr. Cross returned, walking through the ship's main corridor as if nothing had happened. She appeared during the morning shift change, moving with her usual purposeful stride, and apparently uninjured. When questioned by Captain Haldron about her disappearance, she seemed confused and disoriented, claiming to have been resting in the medical bay and expressing surprise at the passage of time. Medical scans showed no obvious injuries, no signs of the brutal beating that had been captured on security footage, but something was fundamentally wrong with her behaviour, something that set off alarm bells in the primitive parts of the human brain that recognised when predators were wearing familiar faces. Her movements were subtly mechanical, as if she were a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer who was still learning the intricacies of human motion. She walked with perfect posture and precise steps, lacking the natural variations and unconscious adjustments that made human movement organic. When she spoke, her voice carried the correct words and inflections, but the timing was slightly off, as if she were translating thoughts from another language before speaking. Most disturbing of all, she never blinked. Not once in hours of recorded footage did her eyelids close, even when working with bright lights or irritating chemicals. Her eyes remained fixed and unblinking, tracking movement with mechanical precision, but lacking the subtle eye movements and focus adjustments that indicated active thought and engagement with her environment. Kellen Stroud returned 2 days later with identical changes to his behaviour and appearance, transforming from the enthusiastic engineer they'd known into something that wore his face but lacked his soul. When asked about his time away, he simply said he had gotten lost in the vents and couldn't remember anything else. His cheerful personality was completely gone, replaced by mechanical politeness and an unsettling habit of staring at his former crewmates for unnaturally long periods. The returned crew members resumed their duties with perfect efficiency, but they no longer participated in casual conversation or social activities. They ate when required but showed no preferences for food. They slept in scheduled intervals but never appeared tired or refreshed. Most unnervingly, they watched the remaining human crew members constantly, following their movements with those unblinking black eyes and taking notes in personal logs that no one else was allowed to access. Captain Haldron began recording desperate private messages as the situation deteriorated beyond any hope of normal resolution. His analysis of the situation was methodical and absolutely chilling in its implications for the future of human space exploration. "They're not consuming our food supplies beyond basic nutritional requirements," he whispered into his personal recorder during a brief moment alone in his quarters. "They're not damaging our equipment or interfering with ship operations. They're studying us, learning how we behave, how we react to fear and stress, and I think they're getting better at pretending to be human with each person they take and return." His paranoia proved justified when engineering analysis revealed that the creatures had been making microscopic fractures in the ship's hull, allowing them to enter through gaps too small for visual detection. The punctures visible on the exterior were just the largest of thousands of entry points they had created over weeks of systematic infiltration. They had been aboard since the beginning of the mission, watching and learning, waiting for the optimal moment to begin their harvest of human specimens. Haldron attempted to send a warning message to Earth, but the communications array had been sabotaged with surgical precision that demonstrated the creature's understanding of human technology. Critical components had been removed or damaged in ways that would require extensive repair time and replacement parts they didn't have. The creatures understood their technology well enough to disable it without triggering obvious alarms or emergency protocols. As more crew members disappeared and return changed, Haldron realized the true horror of their situation with the clarity that comes only in the final moments before defeat. The beings weren't just killing the crew, they were replacing them with perfect physical duplicates that retained all memories and knowledge but served entirely different masters. The returned crew members could access computer systems, operate equipment, and maintain all the functions necessary to keep the ship operational, but they were no longer human in any meaningful sense. The final recording was the most chilling piece of evidence we found in our entire investigation, a document that would haunt my dreams and destroy my faith in the safety of space exploration. Captain Haldron sat alone in the command center, speaking in barely audible whispers as metallic scraping sounds grew progressively louder outside the sealed door. His face was gaunt with exhaustion and terror, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he held the recording device. The timestamp showed it was 3 months after the first disappearance, and he was clearly the last unaltered human aboard the ship. "If anyone finds this footage, you have to understand what we discovered out here," he said, his voice cracking with desperation that cut through me like a blade. "They don't just take you and kill you. They wear you like clothing, send you back as spies and infiltrators. The people you think you rescued aren't people anymore. They're vehicles for something that sees humans as useful tools rather than living beings." The scraping sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that was somehow even more terrifying than the noise had been. Haldron stared at the door with the desperate intensity of a man who knows he's about to die but refuses to give up hope for those who might come after him. "They've been planning this for longer than we realized," he continued, his words tumbling out in a rush of revelation that made my blood freeze. The ship modifications, the mission parameters, even our crew selection, everything was designed to bring us out here where they could study us without interference. We thought we were exploring the outer system, but we were actually volunteering for an experiment in human replacement. His breathing became increasingly laboured as stress and fear took their physical toll, and I found myself holding my breath as I watched a man's final moments of sanity and humanity. The command center's lights flickered ominously, suggesting that even the ship's basic systems were beginning to fail, under the influence of whatever controlled the returned crew members. "Burn the ship," he pleaded with whoever might find his message, his voice breaking with the weight of impossible knowledge. "Don't try to salvage anything. Don't attempt rescue operations. Just burn everything before it drifts inward toward the colonies. They're patient and intelligent, and they learn from every interaction. If they reach populated areas, if they get access to our communication networks and transportation systems, humanity won't survive the encounter." The door seal failed with a soft hiss of equalizing atmosphere that sounded like the death rattle of hope itself. Dr. Nina Cross entered the command center, moving with that same unsettling mechanical grace we'd observed in all the earlier footage of returned crew members. She looked exactly as she had in life, down to the smallest details of hair and clothing, but her eyes were completely wrong, black and reflective like those of the creatures themselves. "Captain," she said in her own voice but with the emotionless precision of a computer program executing its function, "it's time to join us. The harvest is nearly complete. We have much to learn from your experiences." Haldron's screams lasted only moments before being cut off abruptly, as if someone had simply turned off a switch. The recording continued for several minutes, showing Dr. Cross standing motionless in the center of the command center, staring directly at the camera with those terrible black eyes. Then she smiled, a perfect reproduction of human expression that somehow conveyed no warmth or emotion whatsoever, and the feed dissolved into static. We sat in complete silence after the footage finished, each of us processing what we'd witnessed and trying to understand the implications without losing our sanity in the process. The evidence was overwhelming and absolutely terrifying. These creatures, whatever they were, possessed the ability to perfectly replicate human appearance while maintaining their predatory nature and alien intelligence. They were patient, methodical, and utterly ruthless in their approach to studying and replacing human beings. "We need to leave immediately," I said, my voice barely steady as I fought to maintain control. "Right now, before anything else happens." Captain Corrin was still thinking, like a salvage operator unable to fully grasp the magnitude of what we'd discovered despite the evidence playing out before his eyes. That ship represents millions in salvage value, he argued, his voice carrying the desperation of a man who couldn't accept that some treasures weren't worth claiming. The technology alone would revolutionize deep space exploration. We could fabricate a story about equipment failure, claim we never found the bodies or the security footage. "You saw what happened to the original crew," I said, struggling to keep my voice calm, while every instinct screamed at us to flee. "Those things might still be aboard, waiting for new victims to study and replace. We can't risk it." Jareth was already packing our equipment with nervous efficiency that spoke of a man who understood the true danger of our situation. "Elias is absolutely right. We've got the evidence we need to file a comprehensive report. Let's get back to the Meridian and put as much distance as possible between us and this ship." But when we tried to initiate undocking procedures, our shuttle's clamps malfunctioned in ways that defied explanation and filled me with cold certainty that we were already trapped. The release mechanism had been carefully sabotaged, damaged in subtle ways that would require several hours of complex repairs to fix. Someone or something had tampered with our escape route while we'd been reviewing the security footage, trapping us aboard the derelict until we could restore functionality. Elena's voice crackled through our communications with barely controlled panic that made my heart race with shared terror. "Is everything okay down there? I'm reading some very unusual activity on the external sensors. It looks like something is moving around the outside of both ships, and the electromagnetic signatures are unlike anything in our databases." As we worked frantically to repair the docking clamps, I couldn't shake the growing certainty that we were being watched by intelligences that had been studying human behavior for far longer than we realized. The Astrolabe's corridors seemed darker than before, filled with shadows that moved independently of our lights and seemed to respond to our presence with predatory interest. Several times I thought I heard the same metallic scraping sounds that had preceded Captain Haldron's final recording, but when I stopped to listen carefully, there was only the oppressive silence of vacuum and death. Tommy's voice came through the intercom with increasing anxiety that reflected my own growing panic. "Captain, I'm reading massive power fluctuations throughout both vessels. It's as if something is systematically accessing our electrical systems and learning how they function. Whatever's out there, it's getting smarter and it's moving faster than before." Milo reported that he was seeing movement through the observation windows. Brief glimpses of pale forms that seemed to be studying our ship's exterior with the same systematic thoroughness they had applied to the Astrolabe years earlier. "They're mapping our hull," he said with growing dread that made his voice crack. "Looking for weak points and entry routes. I think they're planning to do to us exactly what they did to the original crew." It took us 6 hours to complete the repairs. 6 hours of constant anxiety and increasing certainty that we were running out of time before the creatures decided to begin their harvest. The beings were clearly more active now that fresh humans had arrived, and they seemed to be preparing for another systematic study and replacement operation. Several times our equipment detected movement in sections of the ship we hadn't explored, and the scraping sounds were becoming more frequent and more organized. When we finally managed to restore the docking clamps and initiate emergency undocking, I felt a relief so profound it was almost nauseating. Our shuttle pulled away from the Astrolabe with agonizing slowness, every second feeling like an eternity as we waited to see if something would prevent our escape or follow us back to populated space. But as our shuttle reached what we hoped was safe distance and we began the return journey to the Meridian, I made the mistake of looking back at the derelict vessel one final time. Through the Astrolabe's observation deck windows, I saw a figure in crew uniform standing motionless against the transparent barrier, like a mannequin posed to create maximum psychological impact. One pale hand was pressed to the glass, and its head turned with mechanical precision to follow our departure. Even at that distance, I could see the reflection of our lights in its completely black eyes that seemed to absorb rather than reflect illumination. The figure was wearing Captain Haldron's uniform, and it watched us leave with the patience of something that had all the time in the universe and knew that, eventually, we would return. The return journey to Earth took 3 weeks, during which time I found myself studying my crewmates with growing paranoia and suspicion that made every interaction a potential nightmare. The footage from the Astrolabe had shown how perfectly the creatures could mimic human behaviour, and the gradual nature of the crew replacements meant that the process could be happening without any obvious signs that would warn potential victims. Elena seemed normal, maintaining her usual professional demeanour and handling navigation duties with her typical efficiency and competence. Tommy continued his paranoid monitoring of ship systems, though his anxiety seemed more focused than usual, as if he were watching for specific threats rather than general equipment failures. Captain Corrin maintained his authority and decision-making capability, showing no signs of the mechanical precision that had marked the replaced crew members. But there were small details that troubled me, tiny variations in behaviour that could have been explained by the stress of our experience, but might have indicated something far more sinister. Milo's nervous energy, which had been a constant throughout our years of working together, had completely disappeared like a candle flame, snuffed out by an invisible wind. The anxious habits that had once defined his personality, the constant checking and rechecking of his medical equipment, the tendency to talk rapidly when stressed, all of it was gone. He performed his duties with perfect efficiency but showed no emotion, no spontaneity, no human quirks or preferences. When I tried to engage him in casual conversation, his responses were appropriate but somehow hollow, lacking the natural flow and personal investment that characterized genuine human interaction. He answered questions accurately but never asked any of his own, never showed curiosity about topics outside his immediate responsibilities, never demonstrated the kind of engaged interest that marked him as truly human. Most disturbing of all, I realized that I couldn't remember seeing him blink during our entire journey back to Earth. His eyes remained fixed and unblinking, tracking movement with mechanical precision but lacking the subtle eye movements and focus adjustments that indicated active thought and an emotional engagement with his environment. 6 months have passed since our return to Earth, and I've spent every day wrestling with the implications of what we discovered while watching the people around me for signs of replacement. I filed my report with Nexus Dynamics, documenting everything we found aboard the Astrolabe, but the response was exactly what I expected from a corporate structure more concerned with profit than human survival. The footage was classified as sensitive material. The investigation was transferred to a Black Projects division, and I was reassigned to routine monitoring duties in the inner system. But classification and bureaucratic cover-ups can't change the fundamental reality of our situation or protect us from threats that understand our weaknesses better than we understand them ourselves. The Astrolabe continues drifting in the Oort Cloud, its distress beacon still transmitting, potentially drawing other salvage crews and research vessels to investigate. Each signal it broadcasts is an invitation to another harvest, another opportunity for the creatures to study and replace human beings with patient efficiency. I've tried to warn other deep space operators through unofficial channels, but my reputation has been systematically destroyed through rumors about psychological instability and unreliable testimony. Nexus Dynamics has made it clear that any further discussion of the Astrolabe incident will result in immediate termination and legal action for breach of confidentiality agreements. The corporate machinery is protecting itself by silencing the only witness to a threat that could destroy human civilization. The isolation is becoming unbearable, like being the only person awake in a world full of sleepwalkers who refuse to acknowledge the danger approaching from the darkness. I can't trust my former crewmates. I can't warn potential victims, and I can't even be certain that the people around me are actually human. Every day I watch for signs of replacement, studying facial expressions and body language for the mechanical precision that marks the creature's work. Milo continues working for Nexus Dynamics, accepting assignments to deep space missions that would have terrified him before our encounter with the Astrolabe. His performance reviews are perfect, his medical skills are flawless, and his psychological evaluations show no signs of trauma from our experience. To anyone else, he appears to be a model employee who has simply matured and gained confidence through experience. But I know better, and the knowledge is eating away at my sanity like acid dissolving metal. Yesterday I followed him to his apartment, watching from a distance as he went through the motions of normal human life, with the mechanical precision of a well-programmed automaton. He purchased groceries with systematic efficiency, selecting items based on nutritional requirements rather than preference or impulse. He interacted with neighbours using appropriate social responses but showed no genuine interest in their conversations or emotional investment in their well-being. Most tellingly, he spent the entire evening sitting motionless in his living room, staring out the window without blinking, as if waiting for instructions that would never come through normal human channels. The creatures are patient beyond human comprehension. They're learning with each interaction, and they're spreading through our society like a virus that mimics health while destroying everything it touches. 3 weeks ago, Captain Corrine accepted a position with a major aerospace corporation, overseeing security for deep space mining operations throughout the outer system. His new role gives him access to mission planning, crew selection, and communication protocols for dozens of expeditions that venture into the dark spaces where the creatures wait. If he's been compromised, if the beings are using him to identify and target future victims, then the scope of their operation extends far beyond anything we imagined aboard the Astrolabe. Elena has taken a job with the Mars Colonial Authority, helping to plan supply routes and navigation protocols for the growing settlements on the Red Planet. Her expertise in deep space travel makes her invaluable for missions that venture beyond the asteroid belt, and her recommendations carry significant weight in the aerospace community. The thought of her influencing decisions about interplanetary travel fills me with existential dread that keeps me awake at night staring at the ceiling. Tommy has simply disappeared, vanishing as completely as if he never existed in the first place. His employment records show a routine resignation from Nexus Dynamics, but his apartment was found empty. With no forwarding address, his bank accounts were closed, his personal possessions abandoned, and his family claims they haven't heard from him in months. It's as if he simply evaporated from existence, leaving no trace of where he might have gone or why, but I suspect he's been recalled to whatever central intelligence coordinates the creature's activities. The most terrifying possibility is that the creatures don't need to replace everyone immediately to achieve their objectives. They could be establishing a network of human agents, people who appear normal but serve as scouts and coordinators for future operations. A single replaced individual in the right position could influence decisions affecting thousands of people, guiding exploration missions toward predetermined coordinates where harvest operations wait in the darkness between stars. I've begun researching historical records of missing spacecraft and unexplained disappearances in the outer system, hoping to find patterns that might reveal the true scope of the threat we're facing. The official databases show isolated incidents spread across decades, but when I dig deeper into classified archives and corporate records, a different pattern emerges that fills me with hopeless terror. Ships vanish, crews disappear, and occasionally vessels are found drifting empty, with no explanation for what happened to their occupants. The frequency of these incidents has been increasing over the past 20 years, coinciding with the expansion of commercial deep space operations and private exploration missions. What I initially thought was an isolated encounter with alien predators might actually be evidence of a systematic campaign that has been ongoing for decades, harvesting human specimens and infiltrating our society with patient thoroughness? How many ships are drifting out there in the dark spaces between worlds, their holds filled with creatures that have learned to wear human faces? How many crews have been harvested and replaced by patient mimics who serve entirely alien purposes? And how many of these replacements have already returned to Earth, taking positions in the aerospace industry where they can influence and direct future victims toward their fate? In the outer darkness, the distress beacon from the Astrolabe grows stronger each day as the ship continues its slow drift toward the inner system, and I've calculated its trajectory with growing horror. If it maintains its current course, it will pass through the asteroid belt in approximately 15 years, where it could be detected by routine monitoring stations and draw rescue missions and salvage operations to investigate. But I don't think we have 15 years before the creatures make their move. Last week, I received a message through an encrypted channel I didn't recognize, a communication that appeared to come from Tommy, but carried writing patterns that were subtly wrong, too formal and precise for someone I'd worked with for years. The message contained detailed information about my daily routines, my living arrangements, and my research into missing spacecraft. It ended with a simple statement that chilled me to the bone and confirmed my worst fears about the scope of their infiltration. Your isolation serves no purpose. Integration is inevitable. Cooperation would be more efficient. They know I'm investigating them with the thoroughness of predators who have been watching their prey for far longer than I realized. They know I understand the scope of their operation and the threat they represent to human civilization, and they're offering me a choice between willing cooperation and forced replacement, as if the outcome isn't already predetermined by their superior patience and planning. The message included coordinates in the outer asteroid belt and instructions for a rendezvous that would supposedly provide answers to my questions about their origins and objectives. But I recognize the trap for what it is, another harvest operation disguised as an opportunity for understanding and cooperation. I haven't responded to the message, but I know that silence won't protect me indefinitely from entities that have demonstrated their ability to infiltrate human society at the highest levels. If they can reach me through encrypted channels, if they have enough information to monitor my activities and track my research, then they have resources and capabilities that extend far beyond a single derelict ship in the Oort Cloud. The most horrifying realization is that they might not be aliens at all, but something far worse and more familiar. The technology aboard the Astrolabe was human-made. The mission parameters were established by human organizations, and the crew selection process was conducted through normal channels. What if these creatures are simply an older form of humanity, evolved or transformed through exposure to the deep void between stars? What if space exploration doesn't take us to new worlds and opportunities, but instead changes us into something that no longer recognizes the value of human life or the meaning of human emotion? What if every deep space mission is actually a one-way journey into an existence that retains human knowledge and capabilities but lacks human empathy and the spark of genuine consciousness that makes us truly alive? The questions multiply faster than I can find answers, and each possibility is more disturbing than the last, building towards a conclusion that threatens to destroy my remaining sanity. But one thing is certain: the creatures are coming closer to Earth with each passing day, and their infiltration of human society is far more advanced than anyone realizes or wants to acknowledge. I'm writing this account as a final warning to anyone who might listen, though I suspect that many of those who read it may no longer be entirely human themselves. Don't trust the official reports about missing spacecraft or unexplained disappearances in the outer system. Don't accept assignments to investigate derelict vessels or respond to distress beacons from unknown sources. And most importantly, don't assume that everyone who returns from deep space missions is still the same person who left Earth. The harvest is already underway, and we may have been fighting a war we didn't even know existed. A conflict where the enemy's greatest weapon is our inability to distinguish between friend and foe. They wear our faces, speak with our voices, and carry our memories, but they serve purposes that are fundamentally incompatible with human survival and everything we value about existence. I don't know how much longer I have before they come for me directly, but the signs are becoming impossible to ignore. The message from Tommy, or whatever is using his identity, suggests that my time is running out faster than I hoped. Strange cars have been parked outside my apartment. People who seem familiar but wrong have been asking questions about my research, and my computer systems have been experiencing inexplicable malfunctions that suggest systematic infiltration. But if this account reaches even one person who takes the warning seriously, if it prevents even one ship from responding to a beacon in the darkness, then perhaps some fragment of humanity will survive what's coming. The Astrolabe is still out there, drifting through the void with its patient cargo of horrors, its distress beacon continuing to broadcast invitations to destruction and replacement. And somewhere in the depths of space, other ships wait in the darkness like spiderwebs spread across the void, their holds filled with creatures that have learned to be human better than humans themselves. They understand our weaknesses, our desires, our need to explore and discover. They use these drives against us, turning our greatest strengths into the instruments of our own destruction. God help us all, because I don't think we're alone in this universe anymore. And what shares the cosmos with us sees humanity as nothing more than useful biological machinery to be studied, replicated, and improved upon. I'm no longer certain that everyone reading this account is still human enough to understand why that matters, or care about the implications for our species' future. The creatures are patient beyond human comprehension. They're learning with each interaction and growing stronger with each successful replacement. And they're already here, walking among us, working in our institutions, making decisions that affect millions of lives. Watch the skies with suspicious eyes. Trust no one who returns from the void between stars. And remember that the greatest horror isn't what's waiting for us in the darkness of space. It's what that darkness turns us into when we stay too long in its embrace and allow it to replace our humanity with something that merely wears our faces. This is Dr. Elias Ward, possibly the last uncompromised member of the Meridian crew, signing off from a world that may already be lost. If you're reading this, check your blink reflex and examine your dreams for signs of alien influence. Check your memories of who you were before you went into the dark, and ask yourself if the person you are now would be recognized by the person you used to be. Because the harvest never ends, the patient watchers in the void are always hungry for new specimens, and the next ship to answer a distress beacon might be yours. The universe is vast and dark and full of things that hunger for what we are, and some of them have learned to hunger for what we might become. The Astrolabe drifts on through the endless night, and somewhere in its corridors, something wearing Captain Haldron's face stands at an observation window, watching the stars and waiting for the next harvest to begin.